What would you do if in the heart of a blizzard a grieving rancher rescued a chained woman from a brutal auction? Was it mercy, madness, or fate guiding his hand? Could two broken souls bound only by survival discover warmth and purpose when the storm outside never ends? The wind was a razor against my cheek, a constant whining thing that had been my only real companion for years. It scoured the plains, piling snow into drifts that buried fence lines and turned the familiar landscape into a vast, unforgiving sea of white. My world had shrunk to the size of my cabin, the barn, and the narrow, hard-won paths between them. 10 winters I'd faced alone since Sarah was laid to rest on the hill, her grave marked by a simple wooden cross that was now likely just a sliver of darkness against the snow. My name is Caleb Hayes, and the silence of this land had seeped into my bones. The ranch was all I had left of her, of the life we'd planned. It was a stubborn, half-dead thing, much like myself, and keeping it from collapsing was the only sermon I preached, the only prayer I muttered into the frozen air each morning. The days were marked by the rhythmic chop of the axe, the creak of the well pump, and the howl of the wind. It was a simple, brutal arithmetic. Wood meant fire. Fire meant life. But the salt pork was running low, and the coffee tin was nearly empty. The wick in my last lantern was sputtering its final breaths. A trip to Stone Creek was unavoidable, a journey I dreaded more than the cold itself. Town meant people, and people meant questions. I had no answers for pity I didn't want, and memories that were best left buried under the snow of the past. The war had taken more from me than just the feeling in my left leg on the coldest days. It had scraped me hollow, and Sarah's passing had filled that hollowness with a permanent aching frost. I told myself it would be a quick trip, in and out. Salt coffee, lamp oil, and a new blade for my saw. No lingering, no talk. The last time I'd stayed past dusk, a drunkard at the saloon had clapped me on the back, his breath thick with cheap whiskey, and asked if I still heard the cannons roar at night. I'd simply turned and walked out, leaving my half-finished drink on the bar. There was nothing to say. You can't explain the sound of ghosts to a man who's never been haunted. Hitching the two sturdy mules, Nell and Pete, to the sledge was a battle against the cold. The leather was stiff as iron, and my fingers, even in thick wool gloves, quickly grew numb. The sky was a sheet of bruised pewter, promising more snow before nightfall. The air was so cold it felt solid, a physical weight in my lungs with every breath. I wrapped a thick wool scarf around the lower half of my face, pulled my fur-lined hat down low, and settled into the worn wooden seat. The runners of the sledge cut through the snow with a crisp sighing sound, and the ranch disappeared behind me, swallowed by the swirling white. The journey was a long, cold meditation. The world was shades of white and gray, the skeletal arms of cottonwood trees reaching for a sky that offered no warmth. I kept my eyes on the mules' backs, their steady rhythm a small comfort in the vast emptiness. My mind, as it often did, drifted back to Sarah. I saw her standing on the porch of the cabin, her hands wrapped in an apron, her laughter a sound that could make even the harshest winter feel like spring. "Be safe, Caleb," she would have said, her voice a warm thread in the cold tapestry of my memory. The thought was a familiar pang, a wound that never quite healed. Stone Creek appeared out of the white haze like a mirage. A collection of dark, snow-dusted buildings huddled together for warmth. Smoke curled from stone chimneys, the only sign of life in the frozen town. I guided the mules down the main street, which was little more than a wide, packed snow track. The usual bustle was gone, replaced by a grim, hurried silence. Men moved with their shoulders hunched, their faces hidden by scarves and collars, their breath pluming in the frigid air. I would have gone straight to the general store, would have gotten my supplies, and turned the sledge right back around for home if not for the noise. It was a raw, ugly sound, a knot of male voices rising from the old livery stable, a place usually deserted in this weather. There was laughter, sharp and cruel, the sound of someone spitting, and the low murmur of a crowd drawn by the promise of spectacle. I didn't want to know. My business was my own, but the path was narrowed by the gathering, and Nell and Pete slowed their ears, twitching at the commotion. Then I heard the words carried on the biting wind. Auction. Last one. Stubborn as a frozen mule. My hands, which had been numb, tightened on the reins. A cold that had nothing to do with the weather seeped into my gut. I set the brake, the iron teeth biting into the packed snow, and stepped down from the sledge. My bad leg protested the sudden movement with a sharp, grinding pain. I pushed my way through the outer ring of onlookers, men in thick coats and worn hats, their faces pinched and curious. And then I saw her. She was the center of it all, a still point in the swirling ugliness. They had her tethered to a thick support beam, a heavy iron chain wrapped around her wrists. She stood perfectly upright, her chin level, her back straight. She wasn't defiant, not exactly. It was something deeper, a refusal to be broken that was as absolute as the winter itself. Her eyes, dark and clear, were fixed on a point somewhere beyond the men who ringed her, as if looking through them, rendering them insignificant. She wore a deerskin dress torn and stained from travel. The cold had turned the exposed skin of her arms and shoulders a dusky mottled red, but she didn't shiver. Or if she did, she refused to let them see it. Her hair, black as a raven's wing, was a tangled mess, partly braided, partly pulled loose. It fell around a face that was all sharp angles and stoic endurance. She was young, younger than I'd first thought, maybe not even 25. Her face was smudged with dirt, but it couldn't hide the fierce intelligence in her eyes, nor the exhaustion that lay deep beneath it. "Ain't said a word in 3 days," a man beside me muttered, not to me but to the air. "The others they sold, cried and begged, made it easy. Not this one, just stands there, like a damn statue." He spat a brown stream of tobacco juice that froze almost instantly on the ground. "Some say she's cursed." My jaw ached from clenching it. I knew that look in her eyes. I'd seen it in the faces of men who had seen too much, who had been pushed past the edge of what a soul could bear. I'd worn it myself for a year after the war, a mask of emptiness to keep the world at bay. It was the look of someone who had nothing left to lose, and so had nothing left to fear. I could have turned around. It would have been the sensible thing to do. Buy my coffee and salt, go home to my silence, and pretend I hadn't seen her. The ranch would still be there, the fences would still need mending, and Sarah's grave would still wait for my one-sided conversations. Life would go on a straight, cold line. But I knew what would happen if I left. The sun would set, the crowd would thin, and some man, his pockets heavier than his conscience, would buy her. A man with whiskey on his breath and cruelty in his heart. The thought settled in my stomach like a block of ice. I thought of Sarah, of the gentleness in her hands, of the way she'd cared for a wounded bird one spring. To walk away from this felt like a betrayal of her. A betrayal of the man I had once been, the man she had loved. My hand moved of its own accord, pushing inside my heavy coat to the small leather pouch where I kept my money. It wasn't much, just enough for my supplies and a little extra for emergencies. I suppose this was an emergency. I pushed through the last few men until I stood before the one who seemed to be in charge, a portly man with a florid face and small, greedy eyes. He was stamping his feet to keep warm, his breath coming in short, impatient puffs. My voice, when it came, was a rusty croak from disuse. "How much?" The man blinked, startled. He looked me up and down, taking in my worn coat, my untrimmed beard, the weary set of my shoulders. He must have seen me as just another lonely rancher, though he couldn't have known the depth of it. He named a price. It was more than she was worth to him after 3 days of no sale, but less than the sum I held in my hand. I didn't haggle. I simply pulled the folded bills and coins from my pouch and pressed them into his gloved palm. He looked at the money, then at me, then at the woman. A flicker of surprise, then satisfaction. "Something for nothing. You want a bill of sale," he grunted, already fumbling with a large iron key to unlock the chains. "No," I said. The word was a stone in the cold air. The chains fell away from her wrists with a heavy clank. The sound was unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet that had fallen over the small crowd. The woman didn't move. She didn't rub her raw, chafed wrists. She just stood there, her eyes finally shifting, landing on me. There was no gratitude in them, no relief. Just a quick, sharp assessment, the way a wild animal sizes up a new threat. She was deciding if I was a different kind of cage. I turned without a word and walked back toward the sledge. I didn't look back to see if she was following. I didn't touch her, didn't guide her. I climbed onto the seat, my legs screaming in protest, and picked up the reins. I felt more than saw her climb into the back. She sat on the rough planking of the sledge bed, as far from me as she could get, a small, upright figure against the vast white landscape. I clucked to the mules, and the sledge began to move. We slid out of Stone Creek, leaving the knot of men and their ugly laughter behind. The wind picked up, whipping fine, stinging crystals of snow into our faces. She had no coat, only the torn deerskin. Her shivering was visible now, a fine, uncontrollable tremor that shook her entire body. Without a word, I shrugged out of my heavy sheepskin coat. It was an awkward, clumsy motion, but I managed it. I reached back and held it out to her. She stared at the coat, then at my outstretched hand, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. For a long moment, I thought she would refuse. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she took it. She didn't put it on, but simply wrapped it tightly around her shoulders, pulling it close like a shield. The miles stretched on in a heavy, unbroken silence. The only sounds were the sigh of the runners, the jingle of the harness, and the relentless moan of the wind. I kept my eyes fixed on the path ahead, but my mind was a whirlwind. What in God's name have I done? I had brought a stranger into my life, a wild, wounded woman who looked at me with the eyes of a cornered wolf. I had brought a complication into the simple, painful solitude I had so carefully constructed. I glanced back once. She was huddled under the coat, her face turned away from the wind, her gaze fixed on the horizon. I saw the raw red skin of her wrists, stark against the dark wool of my coat. I wondered what her name was, where she came from, what horrors she had seen. And I wondered if I had just made the biggest mistake of my life, or if for the first time in 10 years I had finally done something right. The sky grew darker, the snow began to fall in earnest, and the long, cold road home stretched out before us. The last hour of the journey was a battle against the encroaching twilight and the thickening storm. The snow was no longer falling. It was being driven a horizontal blizzard that reduced visibility to a few feet and stung any exposed skin like 1,000 tiny needles. The mules, bless their stubborn hearts, knew the way home, their heads bowed against the onslaught. I was a block of ice, my beard stiff with frost, my hands and feet long past feeling. Behind me she remained silent. I could feel her presence, a small knot of warmth and tension huddled under my coat. I didn't know if she was afraid or cold or simply numb. She was an unknown quantity, a variable in the rigid equation of my life. When the dark shape of the cabin finally loomed out of the swirling snow, a wave of relief so profound it almost buckled me, washed over. The small, squat structure banked with snow to its windowsills had never looked so much like a sanctuary. I guided the mules to a stop by the barn, the familiar scent of hay and animals a welcome anchor in the storm. Climbing down from the sledge was agony. My joints were frozen solid and my bad leg felt like it was full of shattered glass. I moved with the stiff, shuffling gait of an old man, my body a testament to the war and the winters. I unhitched the mules and led them into the relative warmth of the barn, their breath steaming in the lantern light. I gave them fresh hay and water, my movements automatic, honed by years of repetition. When I came back out, she was still sitting on the sledge, a statue draped in my coat. The snow was piling up on her shoulders. "You can come inside," I said, my voice rough. The words felt strange, addressing someone other than the mules or myself. She watched me for a moment, her dark eyes unreadable in the gloom. Then she slid off the sledge, her movements stiff from the cold. She stood in the snow, her bare feet and ankles exposed by the torn dress. I saw a flicker of pain cross her face as the intense cold bit at her skin, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. I pushed open the cabin door, which protested with a loud groan, and stepped aside. I wanted her to see the space before I entered it, to know there were no surprises waiting in the shadows. She hesitated on the threshold, then stepped inside, moving with a cautious, deliberate grace. The cabin was one room bisected by a low wall I'd built to give the illusion of separation. A large stone hearth dominated one end, a pot-bellied stove squatting in the center. My bed, a sturdy frame I'd built myself, was in one corner. In the other was a smaller, lower cot, the one Sarah had used in her final weeks when climbing into our bed became too much for her. The sight of it sent a familiar spear of grief through me. The air was frigid, smelling of cold ash and solitude. I moved past her to the hearth, my first priority to bring life back into the cold stone. I laid the kindling and logs with practiced hands, and soon a small hungry flame was licking at the dry wood. I gestured toward the cot. "You can have that bed," I said. "It's yours." I didn't know what else to say. I didn't lay down rules or make demands. I didn't tell her she was free to go, because where would she go in this storm? And I didn't tell her she had to stay. Ownership was a bitter taste in my mouth. I had bought her to free her, not to trade one master for another. What that meant now, I had no idea. She stood by the door, her eyes taking in everything, the stove, the beds, the single shelf holding my few plates and a tin basin. Her gaze lingered on the small worn ring that lay on the table beside my unread book. Sarah's ring. I hadn't been able to bring myself to wear it after she died, but I couldn't put it away either. It just sat there, a silent testament to a life that was over. Following her gaze, I felt a flush of something, shame or maybe just sorrow. Without a word, I picked up the ring and slid it into my pocket. "I'll get some water," I said, needing to escape the sudden intimacy of the small room. "There's a basin if you want to wash." Outside, the storm was a living thing, a screaming white fury. I broke the ice on the water barrel with the back of an axe and filled 2 buckets. The water so cold it felt like it was burning my skin. When I returned, she was standing by the fire, her hands held out to the growing warmth. She had taken off my coat, and draped it over the back of a chair. The torn deerskin dress seemed even more inadequate in the flickering firelight. The rip at the neckline was deep, exposing the curve of her collarbone and the swell of her chest. She made no move to cover herself. Modesty was a luxury for those who had other protections. I set about making dinner, my movements clumsy and loud in the quiet cabin. I sliced salt pork into a hot skillet and put a pot of beans on to warm. The smell of frying meat filled the room, a scent of simple, honest survival. I ladled the stew into 2 tin bowls and set one on the floor near the hearth by her feet. I took the other to the table. I didn't want to sit across from her to make it feel like an interrogation. I wanted to give her space. She chose to eat there on the floor, cross-legged, with my coat pulled over her lap like a blanket. She ate slowly, methodically, her eyes fixed on the flames. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the howl of the wind outside, and the scrape of our spoons against tin. The silence wasn't hostile, but it was heavy-weighted with everything that was unsaid, unknown. I thought about the morning. The chores wouldn't wait for the storm to pass. I thought about the partition, how I could build it higher to give her more privacy. I thought about the men in Stone Creek and the casual cruelty that passed for entertainment. I looked at her, a still figure in the firelight, and felt a profound weariness. The world was a hard place, and it broke people in so many ways. When we were finished, I took her empty bowl, washed them both in the basin, and set them to dry. I laid an extra wool blanket on the end of her cot. Then I hesitated, and laid a second one on the chair nearby in case the bed itself felt like a trap. Night settled in. I banked the fire, leaving the coals to cast a low orange glow that danced on the rough-hewn walls. I blew out the lamp. The cabin sank into a deep, breathing darkness. I lay down on my bed, fully clothed except for my boots, and stared up at the familiar patterns of the roof beams. I had cut and placed every one of them myself. I knew every knot and crack. Across the room, I could hear the soft rustle of her moving onto the cot. I listened to her breathing, waiting for it to deepen into the rhythm of sleep. But it never did. It remained light watchful. She was listening just as I was, listening for any sound of threat, any shift in the darkness. I thought of Sarah's grave out on the hill, buried under a thick blanket of snow. On Sunday, if the storm broke, I would walk up there. And for the first time, I would have something new to tell her. I brought someone home, Sarah. I brought someone home because leaving her there felt like leaving a part of you behind all over again, and I couldn't bear it. The old guilt was there, a familiar companion, but tonight it was joined by something else. A flicker of purpose, perhaps. Or maybe just the simple human feeling of not being entirely alone in the face of the storm. Hours passed. The fire settled the coals, pulsing like a dying heart. The cold pressed and seeping through the chinks in the logs. Neither of us slept. We just lay there in the shared darkness, 2 strangers bound by a transaction and a blizzard, each of us listening to the other's quiet fight to survive the night. The first light of morning was a pale, grudging gray that did little to pierce the gloom of the cabin. The wind had died down, leaving behind a profound, muffled silence. The world outside was buried. I rose from my bed, my body a symphony of aches. A glance across the room showed her curled on her side on the cot, my old coat pulled up to her chin. Her eyes were closed, but the set of her jaw told me she wasn't truly asleep, merely resting. She had likely kept vigil all night, the same as I. Moving with the quiet economy of a man long used to solitude, I dressed in the semi-darkness, pulled on my stiff boots, and coaxed the fire back to life. The smell of coffee soon filled the small space, a comforting ritual in a world that had been upended. Stepping outside was like stepping into a new, unwritten creation. The snow was waist-deep, a pristine rolling landscape of white. The barn, the fences, the woodpile, all were softened, their sharp edges erased, buried under a thick, soft blanket. A deep sense of isolation washed over me. We were cut off an island in a sea of snow. For now, this cabin, this small patch of land, was the entire world. The work was hard and slow. I dug a path to the barn, the snow heavy and wet. Inside, the animals greeted me with low, anxious sounds. Tending to them was a comfort, the familiar tasks, a bulwark against the uncertainty that now lived in my cabin. There was another set of footprints in my life now, even if they hadn't yet been made in the snow. When I returned to the cabin, chilled to the bone, she was awake. She sat on the edge of the cot upright, and still her long hair a dark curtain hiding part of her face. My coat was still wrapped around her shoulders. Her hands were folded in her lap, her posture one of waiting. "Coffee's hot," I said, my voice a low rumble. I poured a cup and set it on the floor near her. "There's no sugar." She looked at the steaming tin cup but didn't reach for it. I didn't push. I took my own cup to the table and let the hot bitter liquid burn a trail down my throat. The silence stretched thick and awkward. I felt a need to fill it to explain the new shape of our days. "I'll be clearing a path to the woodpile today," I began, speaking to the room as much as to her. "After that, the barn roof needs to be cleared before the weight gets to be too much. There are tools in the shed, if you know how to use them." I trailed off, feeling foolish. She said nothing, her expression unreadable. "You can stay here," I added quickly. "Keep the fire going, or you can come out. It's your choice." I didn't use the word free. It was a cheap word, easily spoken and easily broken. I would show her, not tell her. She finally stood, her movements slow and stiff. Her bare feet touched the cold floorboards, and I saw her wince. I remembered the moccasins. They were in a trunk at the foot of my bed, a pair Sarah had tried to make one winter, her stitching uneven but full of love. They were too small for me, but they might fit her. I retrieved them, and without a word, laid them on the floor beside her cot. "They might fit," I said gruffly. "If not, I can fix them." She looked down at the soft-worn leather, then up at me. For the first time, I saw something other than suspicion in her eyes. It was a flicker of something. Not gratitude, but a kind of weary acknowledgement. She gave the faintest of nods. It was enough. I went back out into the blinding white. The work was brutal. Shoveling the heavy snow was a strain on my back and my bad leg. An hour passed then, too. I was clearing the snow from the lean-to roof when I sensed her presence. I turned, and she was there, standing at the edge of the path I'd cleared. She had my coat on, belted with a piece of rope. The moccasins were on her feet. Her hair was now pulled back in a single thick braid. She didn't ask what to do. She simply watched me work for a few minutes, her gaze analytical. Then she picked up the spare shovel I'd left, leaning against the barn wall, and started on the other side of the roof. Her movements were efficient, strong. She knew this kind of labor. Her hands, though raw, were capable. We worked for hours in a shared silent rhythm. The only sounds were the scrape of our shovels and our own ragged breaths in the thin, cold air. The world was reduced to the task at hand: move the snow, save the roof. It was a language we both understood. It was honest. It required no words. When the sun was at its highest, a pale, hazy disk in the white sky, we stopped. I took out a canteen of water, drank, and handed it to her. She took it without hesitation, drank carefully, and handed it back. Our fingers brushed for a moment. Her skin was cold, but the touch was like a spark in the frozen air. I pulled my hand back as if burned. That afternoon, we returned to the cabin, exhausted and soaked. While I chopped more wood, she knelt by the chicken coop, inspecting a broken hinge I'd been meaning to fix for a month. She found a piece of wire and a rusted nail, and with a quiet determination fixed it herself. That night, the silence in the cabin felt different. It was no longer the silence of solitude, but the silence of shared exhaustion of a day's work done together. She ate a little more this time, a few bites of salted pork and a hard biscuit. As I was banking the fire, she finally spoke. Her voice was low, raspy from disuse, but clear. Why, I paused, my hand on the poker. I turned to look at her. She was watching me, her dark eyes intense in the firelight. She said it again, firmer this time. "Why did you take me?" I set the poker down and truly looked at her. I thought of the men in the town, of the war, of Sarah. I gave her the only honest answer I had. Because no one else should have, I said, and because the cabin had an empty bed. She held my gaze for a long moment, searching my face for the lie. Finding none, she lowered her eyes. "I will not be owned," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You're not a wife." It wasn't a question. Number, not a slave. Number. She gave a single sharp nod. That was the bargain. That was the treaty signed between two broken nations in the heart of a winter storm. It was enough for now. Later that night, as I sat cleaning a piece of harness, she moved from the cot. She took a blanket, placed it on the floor near the stove, and lay down there instead. She didn't trust the bed. I understood. Trust wasn't a gift you could give someone. It had to be earned inch by painful inch. I left her be. Outside, the world was silent, buried in snow. Inside, the fire murmured, and two people lay in the darkness, not sleeping, but listening to the slow, cautious beat of a fragile piece. She hadn't run. That was something. And tomorrow the work would continue. The days that followed fell into a pattern dictated by the snow and the cold. Each morning began in darkness, the first task always the fire. We moved around each other in the small cabin with a developing economy of motion. A silent dance of two people sharing a confined space. The heavy, watchful silence of the first days began to soften, fraying around the edges, replaced by a quiet companionship born of shared labor. We cleared the rest of the roofs, dug paths to the well and the outhouse, and reinforced a section of the barn wall that was groaning under the weight of a massive drift. She worked as hard as I did, never complaining her resilience. A constant quiet rebuke to the men who had called her worthless. I found myself watching her not with suspicion, but with a growing sense of respect and something else I couldn't quite name. I watched the way her hands, though chapped and red, were surprisingly deft as she mended a tear in one of the horse blankets. I watched the way she stood at the cabin window in the late afternoon, looking out at the endless white, her expression distant and sorrowful. I wondered what she was seeing, what life she was remembering. One afternoon, as a new flurry of snow began to fall, we sat by the fire, seeking refuge from the biting wind. I was oiling my rifle, the familiar scent of gun oil filling the air. She was sharpening a small knife she had found in the kitchen drawer, her movements precise and focused. "You live here a long time?" she asked, her voice still soft, but losing some of its rusty edge. The question surprised me. 10 years with my wife," I said, not looking up from my work. 10 years alone since. She was silent for a moment. Then, "You had no children?" "No," I said. The word was clipped final. It was a door I kept firmly shut. She nodded, as if that explained something fundamental about me. After another long pause, she spoke again, her eyes on the blade in her hands. "They sold me because I would not marry the man my father chose. He was old and cruel." I said no. "They said I brought dishonor to my family." She tested the edge of the blade with her thumb. "After the raid, no one came looking for me." She said it all in a flat, emotionless tone. She wasn't asking for pity. She was stating facts, laying the pieces of her broken life out on the hearth between us. She was showing me her scars. I stopped what I was doing and looked at her. "You don't have to be quiet here," I said, the words feeling inadequate. She looked up, her gaze sharp and penetrating. "Even if I speak against you," I met her eyes. "You can say whatever you need to say." That night she slept on the cot again, not on the floor. I noticed it when I got up to add a log to the fire. She had pulled the blankets up to her chin, her face turned away from me, but she was in the bed. It was a small step, a tiny movement across the vast frozen landscape of her mistrust, but it felt significant. The next morning I found a soft wool shirt of Sarah's, one she had seldom worn, and left it folded at the foot of her cot. It was a gesture I didn't fully understand myself. Maybe I just couldn't stand to see her in that torn deerskin anymore. Maybe it was an apology for my part, however small, in a world that had treated her so brutally. She didn't wear it right away, but a few days later I came in from the barn to find her wearing it over her dress. The sleeves were too long and it hung loosely on her frame, but it was clean and whole. It covered the rip in her dress, and with it some of her vulnerability. The winter deepened. The storms came and went, each one leaving another layer of snow, reinforcing our isolation. The cabin became our world, the fire its sun. We talked more in short, hesitant bursts. She told me her name was Maya. She asked me about the war, and I found myself telling her things I had never told anyone, not even Sarah. I told her about the noise, the fear, and the terrible silence after. I told her how I'd come back feeling like a stranger in my own skin, a ghost haunting the edges of my own life. She listened, her dark eyes full of a deep, sorrowful understanding. She knew about ghosts. One evening, the wind was particularly fierce, rattling the shutters and moaning down the chimney like a lost soul. The cabin felt small and fragile against the storm's fury. We sat close to the fire, the only source of warmth and light. Maya was mending one of my socks, her head bent in concentration, the firelight catching the blue-black sheen of her hair. I was carving a small piece of wood, my hands needing to be busy. "What was her name, Maya?" asked softly without looking up. "Sarah," I said. The name felt strange on my tongue, a word from another language, another life. Was she beautiful, I thought. For a moment, the image of my wife rising in my mind, clear and sharp as a winter morning. "Yes," I said, but not in the way most people mean. She was strong and kind. She could make anything grow, and she had a laugh that could make you forget there was anything bad in the world. Maya nodded, her needle moving in and out of the wool. "You still miss her?" "Every day," I said. It was the simple, unvarnished truth. A long silence fell, filled only by the sound of the wind and the crackling fire. Then she set aside the sock and moved from her chair. She came to where I sat on the floor and knelt beside me. She was so close I could feel the warmth radiating from her smell, the faint, clean scent of wood smoke in her hair. She reached out and placed her hand on my arm. Her touch was light tentative, but it sent a jolt through me that had nothing to do with surprise. It was a touch of connection, of shared humanity in the vast, cold emptiness. It was the first time she had touched me willingly. I looked down at her small, work-roughened hand on my worn sleeve. Then I looked up into her eyes. They were no longer guarded, no longer filled with the ghosts of her past. They were just present. My heart, which I had thought frozen solid for a decade, gave a slow, painful lurch. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just sat there, feeling the warmth of her hand seeping through my coat, through my skin, and into a place I had long thought dead and buried. The storm raged outside, but inside the small, firelit cabin something was beginning to thaw. The blizzard that trapped us was the heart of the winter, a relentless 3-day siege of wind and snow that erased the world. The cabin became an arc adrift on a sea of white. The windows were frosted over, then completely covered, plunging us into a dim, perpetual twilight lit only by the fire and the lantern. The sound of the wind was a constant, deafening roar, a physical pressure against the walls and against our ears. In this forced intimacy, the last of the barriers between us seemed to dissolve. There was nowhere to retreat, no work outside to distract us. There was only the shared space, the shared warmth, the shared silence. And slowly that silence began to fill with words. She told me about her home, a place of sun-warmed rock and pine forests so different from this frozen flatland. She spoke of her mother who had taught her which plants could heal and which could harm. She described her younger sister, her laughter like the sound of a running stream. She spoke of them not with tears, but with a deep, aching reverence, as if tending to precious, fragile memories. In turn, I spoke more of Sarah. I told Maya how we had met, how we had built this cabin with our own hands, the dreams we had etched into every log. I found that saying her name to Maya didn't hurt as much as I expected. It was as if sharing the memory lessened its sharp edges, transformed it from a source of pain into a source of warmth, like holding a memory up to the fire. On the second night of the storm, the cabin was colder than ever. The wind found every tiny chink in the walls. We huddled close to the fire, wrapped in every blanket we owned. The firewood was running low, and a new primal fear began to creep in, the fear of the fire dying. When I was a girl, Maya said, her voice a low murmur against the howl of the wind, my grandmother told me that a fire is like a person's spirit. As long as you tend to it, it will give you warmth and light, but if you neglect it, it grows cold and the darkness comes. I looked at the flames dancing and writhing in the hearth. My spirit's been cold for a long time, I admitted, the confession pulled from a place deep inside me. She looked at me, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. But it is not out, Caleb. It was the first time she had used my name. The sound of it in her voice was both strange and deeply comforting. Later, as the fire burned low and the shadows grew long, she moved closer, not with any suddenness, but with a slow, deliberate purpose. She sat on the floor beside my chair, so close that our knees touched. The small point of contact was a furnace of warmth. My entire being seemed to focus on that single spot. My heart was a heavy, clumsy drum in my chest. I didn't know what to do, what to say. The years of solitude had made me a stranger to this kind of closeness. She placed her hand on mine where it rested on my knee. Her fingers were cool, but her palm was warm. She didn't speak, just held my hand, her thumb gently stroking my calloused knuckles. I looked down at our joined hands, hers, small and brown, mine large and weathered. Two different worlds, two different lives finding a point of contact in the heart of a storm. I didn't pull away. I turned my hand over and laced my fingers through hers. It felt as natural as breathing. We sat like that for a long time, listening to the storm drawing strength from each other's presence. The tension between us was no longer one of fear or uncertainty. It was something else, something new and fragile and powerful. It was the quiet, terrifying pull of two lonely souls recognizing each other in the darkness. When it was time to sleep, she returned to her cot. But before she lay down, she paused and touched my shoulder. Just a brief, light touch. A thank you. A good night. An acknowledgement of the bridge we had just crossed. I lay awake long after her breathing had evened out my hand, still tingling from her touch. I was a man who had made his peace with ghosts, who had accepted that his life was a long, slow walk toward his own grave. But now a living, breathing woman was in my home, in my life. She was chipping away at the ice around my heart with her quiet strength, her gentle presence. And for the first time in a decade, I was afraid. Not of the storm, not of the cold, not of dying. I was afraid of learning how to live again. On the third day, the wind finally broke. A profound silence descended, broken only by the settling groans of the snow-laden roof. I dug my way out of the cabin to a world transformed. The sky was a brilliant aching blue and the sun on the fresh snow was blinding. It was a world of pristine, untouched beauty, a world washed clean. Maya followed me out, blinking in the bright light. She stood on the small patch of cleared ground, pulling the crisp, clean air into her lungs. A small, genuine smile touched her lips. It was the first I had ever seen. It transformed her face, erasing the lines of hardship and revealing the young woman beneath. In that moment, watching her smile in the winter sun, I knew that the storm inside me had also broken. The world was still a hard and lonely place. The ghosts of the past were not gone, but they were no longer the only thing there. There was also Maya, and that I was beginning to realize might be enough. That evening, the air in the cabin was clear and calm. The storm had passed, leaving a deep peace in its wake. We ate our simple meal of beans and dried meat, but the silence was different now. It was comfortable, easy. We were no longer two strangers, but two people who had weathered a storm together and come out the other side changed. After dinner, she didn't retreat to her side of the room. She sat on the hearth near my chair and watched me work on a broken piece of harness. The firelight played on her face, softening its angles, warming the color of her skin. She had taken to wearing Sarah's shirt almost all the time now, the soft wool, a stark contrast to the rough deerskin of her dress, which she still wore beneath it. "You are a good man, Caleb Hayes," she said quietly, her words dropping into the silence like stones into a still pond. I stopped my work, surprised. "What makes you say that you have not tried to own me?" she said, choosing her words carefully. "You gave me a bed, a coat, and silence. You have asked for nothing. You owe me nothing, Maya," I said, my voice rough with an emotion I couldn't name. She shook her head slowly. "In my life, when a man gives a woman something, he always expects something in return. It is the way of the world." "Maybe the world's wrong," I said. She looked at me then, a long, searching look. The fire crackled, spitting a shower of sparks up the chimney. She rose from the hearth and came to stand before me. My heart began its heavy, clumsy beat again. She reached out not to my hand or my arm, but to my face. Her fingers, cool and gentle, traced the rough line of my jaw, the deep lines etched around my eyes. Her touch was a question. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I just watched her, my whole world narrowing to her face, her eyes, the feel of her hand on my skin. Her voice was barely a whisper. Are you sure I knew what she was asking? It wasn't just about this moment. It was about all the moments to come. It was about letting go of the ghosts, about stepping out of the frozen landscape of the past. I gave a slow, deliberate nod. I'm sure. And with that, she leaned in. She pressed her lips to mine. It was not a kiss of passion, not of heat or demand. It was soft, tentative, and deeply, profoundly gentle. It was the taste of wood smoke and sorrow, and a quiet, resilient hope. It was a choice freely made in the quiet of the cabin. I didn't pull her closer. I didn't deepen the kiss. I let her lead, let her decide. I simply met her, a quiet offering of my own. When she pulled back, her eyes were dark and luminous. She didn't say anything else. She didn't have to. She stepped away back to her cot on the other side of the room. She didn't say goodnight. I sat there long after the fire had burned down to embers, the feeling of her lips still on mine. My chest was tight, not with desire, but with a feeling so immense, so overwhelming it felt like grief. It was the feeling of a decade of loneliness crashing down on me, the feeling of a door I had thought locked and barred forever creaking slowly open. The snow-covered world outside was silent and at peace. And inside the cabin, something had warmed. Something had been born in the heart of the winter. We wouldn't name it. Not yet. But for the first time, neither of us was looking for a way out. One of the most meaningful lessons from this story is that even in seasons of silence and lost life, can still offer us unexpected chances to begin again. Caleb thought his world had ended with his wife's passing, and Maya believed her worth was gone when she was cast aside. Yet in the harshest winter, they discovered that survival is not only about food or firewood, it is also about connection. For older audiences, this speaks to the truth that healing rarely comes quickly. It often arrives in quiet gestures, small acts of trust, and the willingness to let someone walk beside us. We may carry grief, war memories, or years of solitude, but the human heart can still thaw even after decades of frost. Choosing compassion over indifference, offering dignity instead of control, can turn strangers into companions and transform loneliness into shared purpose. The story reminds us that we are never too old or too wounded to find renewal. Life's storms may leave us scarred, but they also prepare us to appreciate the warmth of simple kindness when it finally comes. In the end, love is less about grand declarations and more about staying when leaving would be easier. Enjoying these epic Wild West stories? Hit subscribe for more gripping tales of bravery, conflict, and unexpected heroes. Now tap the video on screen to experience a story with a twist you'll never forget.